Confessions of El Chapo, The Secrets of the Sinaloa Empire. In February 2019, the courtroom in Brooklyn was packed to capacity. The atmosphere was heavy, almost palpable, as if the air itself bore the weight of countless gazes fixed on one man, Joaquín Guzmán, better known as El Chapo. Under the harsh lights, his face remained expressionless, an enigma to the hundreds present. Journalists scribbled furiously, capturing every detail, while discreet whispers spread from one bench to another. Joaquín observed it all with an almost supernatural calm. He seemed detached, almost elsewhere, as if this room and these people were merely a fleeting backdrop in a much larger story. At that moment, as the judge read the sentence, a long shiver ran through the room. Yet Guzmán remained unmoved. In his eyes was something elusive, a glimmer that refused to die, even in the face of the inevitability of his fate. As the judge's gavel fell, he offered a faint smile, imperceptible to most, but very real. A smile that spoke of defiance, untold stories, and deeply buried memories. In that moment of tense silence, Joaquín closed his eyes, and the ambient noise seemed to fade. The walls of the courtroom vanished, replaced by the mountains of Sinaloa. The dry heat of the desert mingled with the sweet aroma of poppy flowers. He saw La Tuna again, that remote village where it had all begun. A modest adobe house with walls cracked by time and a thatched roof that sometimes let the rain through. This was where he was born, in the arms of Consuelo, his mother, a strong and resilient woman whose gaze held both tenderness and unyielding determination. She had named him Joaquín, but she always called him Mi Pequeño Luchador, my little fighter. Life in La Tuna was harsh, even ruthless. Children grew up quickly, facing the realities of poverty and survival from a young age. Joaquín's father, Emilio, worked the land. He grew corn but had learned to cultivate another type of plant in the surrounding hills, a plant that promised far more lucrative harvests. Young Joaquín watched his father, fascinated by the silent transactions that sometimes took place late at night. Emilio, though stern, took the time to explain the unspoken rules that governed this invisible world. One evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, Joaquín sat by the fire with his mother. He still remembered her words that night. She had told him a story about the mountain birds, creatures that, despite their small size, dared to face the largest predators. "You are like those birds, Joaquín," she murmured, gently running her fingers through his hair. "Small, but with a big heart. One day, you'll soar higher than anyone else." Those words etched themselves into his mind, an echo he would hear throughout his life. But Joaquín was not just a dreamer. Very early on, he understood that soaring high required more than ambition. It also demanded cunning, strength, and an unyielding will. He grew up watching, learning from the adults around him, and slowly carving his path in a world where weakness had no place. Years passed, and Joaquín became a young man. La Tuna was still his home, but he looked beyond the hills. The stories of men returning from the cities or the coasts intrigued him. He listened intently, asked questions with insatiable curiosity. One day, he heard about a man named Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo, the godfather of the Guadalajara cartel. The name was spoken with a mix of fear and respect. From that moment, Joaquín knew he wanted more than the simple life of a farmer. He wanted to understand the world of cartels, its rules, its hierarchies. But above all, he wanted to conquer it. One evening, while accompanying his father on a discreet delivery, Joaquín witnessed a drug exchange for the first time. The man receiving the goods spoke with a calm yet authoritative voice, and his gaze seemed to probe Emilio's every thought. Hidden in the shadows, Joaquín felt a thrill of excitement. That was where he wanted to be, at the center of power, where decisions were made. When he returned to La Tuna that night, he was no longer quite the same. The mountains, which had always seemed so vast to him, now appeared as just a step in his journey. He knew that one day he would leave this place to venture into a much larger world. That night, as he gazed at the starry sky, he made a silent vow. No matter how long it took or the obstacles he faced, he would climb every mountain and break every chain. He would become someone no one would forget. On a dusty mountain path, Emilio stopped abruptly. Ahead of him stood Pedro Avilés, an imposing man despite his average stature, waiting by an old truck. His hat, yellowed by the sun, partially obscured his face, but his piercing eyes seemed capable of reading every thought. Pedro smiled as he noticed young Joaquín standing back, half hidden behind his father. He had a knack for spotting those who stood out, even if they were just kids. "So, this is your son, Emilio?" Pedro said in a tone of mock casualness, casting an appraising glance at Joaquín. "He looks sharp, this one." Emilio straightened slightly, his back stiff, aware of the importance of this meeting. "Yes, Don Pedro," he replied with a mix of pride and respect. "Joaquín is a good boy. He learns quickly." The young Guzmán, despite his apparent reserve, felt his heart pounding. He knew that being noticed by a man like Pedro Avilés was no small matter. In these mountains, a single word or gesture could change everything. Pedro took a few steps forward, his imposing silhouette casting a long shadow over the cracked earth. He fixed his eyes on Joaquín, a gaze that seemed to weigh a ton. "So, Joaquín, what do you want to do when you grow up?" he asked, his deep, confident voice commanding respect. The boy hesitated for a moment, searching for the right words. His hands trembled slightly, but he clenched his fists, trying to hide his nervousness. "I want to help my father," he finally replied, his voice clear but still hesitant. Pedro let out a small laugh, a mix of surprise and amusement. "Good start, boy. But remember this, here it's not about helping. It's about taking." Joaquín stood frozen, absorbing every word as if they were carved in stone. Pedro then turned back to Emilio, his tone growing more serious. "Take care of him, Emilio. These mountains are full of broken dreams and men who wanted to fly too high. But this one, he might go far." The conversation ended there, but for Joaquín, those words resonated like a prophecy. It was the first time he felt seen, recognized, as if he already belonged to a world far larger than his childhood. On the way back, the silence between Emilio and his son was heavy but meaningful. Emilio, usually a man of few words, finally placed a hand on Joaquín's shoulder. Pedro is a powerful man. If you ever work with him, remember what he told you today. Those are not words to forget. Joaquín nodded without responding, his thoughts already far beyond the hills. He knew that day marked the beginning of something. It wasn't just a meeting. It was a call. A challenge. That night, lying on his makeshift bed, Joaquín stared at the ceiling. The wind whistled through the cracks in the walls, carrying with it the whispers of the mountains. In his mind, Pedro's words echoed over and over. Take. That simple word carried a weight he didn't fully understand yet, but he knew it would become the foundation of his future. Through the flickering shadows cast by the oil lamp, he made a silent promise to himself. No matter the risks, the sacrifices, or the obstacles, one day these mountains would be nothing more than a distant memory, and his name would resonate far beyond La Tuna. The days following his encounter with Pedro Avilés marked a turning point for Joaquín. He accompanied his father with renewed focus, observing every move, listening to every word. Emilio, a man of habit, seemed more cautious, almost nervous, as if he sensed their future had taken a perilous turn. Joaquín, however, saw beyond the hills. Every transaction, every whispered conversation away from prying eyes seemed to map out an invisible network of opportunities he was determined to understand. One morning, as the sun bathed the mountains in golden light, Joaquín joined his father in the fields. Emilio, crouched near the poppy plants, inspected the flowers with meticulous care. Joaquín, armed with a small knife, mimicked his father's movements. "Let me show you how to harvest properly," Emilio said in a calm but firm tone. His hands, calloused and marked by years of labor, guided Joaquín's with almost paternal precision. In those gestures, Joaquín felt a tacit transfer of knowledge, a skill that, though forbidden, was vital for their survival. The nights were different. While Emilio seemed intent on maintaining a semblance of order in their routine, Joaquín's mind was restless. He thought of Pedro, of his words, and of what they meant. He knew that one day he could no longer remain in his father's shadow. The mountains of Sinaloa, vast as they were, now felt small, narrow, incapable of containing the ambition growing within him. One night, as the house lay in deep silence, Joaquín heard murmurs from the next room. He slipped out of bed and crept closer. Emilio was speaking with a man, a stranger whose deep, steady voice seemed to cut through the air. The words were unclear, but Joaquín caught fragments: delivery, border, danger. The boy held his breath. He knew he shouldn't be there, but an irresistible force kept him listening. After the man left, Emilio stepped out and came face to face with his son. "What are you doing here, Joaquín?" he asked, his voice a mix of anger and weariness. Joaquín hesitated, searching for an excuse, but ultimately told the truth. "I want to understand, Father. I want to know what you do and why." Emilio looked at him for a long moment, as if searching for an answer he didn't want to give. Finally, he sighed and placed a heavy hand on Joaquín's shoulder. "What I do, Joaquín, is not for you. It's so you'll never have to do it." But Joaquín knew those words were just a facade. He could already see the gears of this forbidden world turning around him, and he knew he couldn't escape them. The next day, as he walked alone in the hills, he came across a group of men. One of them, tall and imposing, approached him with a sly smile. "You're Emilio's son, right?" he said. Joaquín nodded, feeling the weight of their attention on him. "They say you're sharp. Maybe we'll have some work for you one day." Those words, seemingly innocent, echoed like a promise. That evening, Joaquín returned home with a new feeling, a mix of excitement and fear. He didn't yet know where this road would lead, but he knew he couldn't turn back. The hills of Sinaloa, with their long shadows and hidden secrets, were already calling him. Weeks passed, and Joaquín felt that something was changing in his life. The way the men in the village looked at him had evolved. It was no longer the gaze reserved for a child, but one for someone who was beginning to matter, someone being watched and tested. Emilio, though oblivious to these subtleties, seemed to sense the danger. He issued warnings more frequently, trying to keep his son away from trouble. One evening, as the family shared a frugal meal around the worn wooden table, the silence was broken by sharp knocks at the door. Emilio immediately stood, tense. Joaquín noticed his mother clasping her hands nervously, a gesture she repeated whenever a stranger came to their doorstep. When the door opened, a familiar figure appeared. It was Pedro Avilés, but this time he wasn't alone. Two rough-looking men stood behind him, their piercing gazes cutting through the dimly lit room. Pedro entered without waiting for an invitation, his boots echoing on the dirt floor. Emilio, respectful, asked what had brought him so late. Pedro, after a brief pause, fixed his eyes on Joaquín. "Your boy," he said, "seems curious. That's a rare quality." Emilio started to protest, but Pedro raised a hand to silence him. "Don't worry, Emilio. I'm not here to ask him to do anything he doesn't want to. But a sharp mind shouldn't go to waste. I'm going to give him a chance to learn." Joaquín's heart raced. He knew refusing wasn't an option. Emilio, though reluctant, could only nod. Pedro explained that it would be a simple errand, nothing dangerous. But deep down, Joaquín knew that every small step into this world came with consequences. That night, he didn't sleep. Pedro's words echoed in his mind, a chance to learn. He felt as though he was standing on the brink of a journey whose scale he couldn't yet grasp. At dawn the next day, Pedro returned. Joaquín climbed into the old truck in silence, under the worried gaze of his mother. The drive was long, and Pedro remained quiet, his eyes fixed on the dusty road ahead. After several hours, they reached an isolated warehouse surrounded by mountains. Men moved back and forth, carrying crates and exchanging instructions. The atmosphere buzzed with a strange energy, a mix of tension and efficiency. Pedro stopped in front of a metal door and motioned for Joaquín to follow him. Inside, the air was cool and the smell of damp earth lingered. Bags filled with a white powder were stacked against the walls. Pedro, calm yet authoritative, explained, "Here, everything is about control. Whoever controls the product controls the market. Look closely, Joaquín. Each bag here represents a fortune, but it also represents a war. Remember that." Joaquín listened intently, absorbing every word and detail. Pedro guided him through the warehouse, showing him the different aspects of the operation. Joaquín didn't ask questions. He observed, memorized, and understood that what he was seeing was just a fraction of a much larger system. As they were leaving, Pedro placed a hand on Joaquín's shoulder. "You've made a good impression, boy. But this is only the beginning. If you want to go further, you'll have to prove you're worthy." Joaquín nodded, determined. He felt that this day marked the start of something much bigger. The mountains he had always known now seemed small. The world opening up to him was vast, dangerous, and thrilling. Back home, under his mother's silent gaze and his father's unspoken disapproval, Joaquín knew he had crossed an invisible boundary. Nothing would ever be the same again. But in his heart, a certainty grew. He was ready to do whatever it took to become someone. The days that followed were strange. Joaquín, barely a teenager, was back in the familiar hills of Tuna, but everything seemed different. The dusty paths he had walked as a child now felt imbued with new meaning, almost solemn. He felt the weight of what he had seen in Pedro Avilés' warehouse. It wasn't just bags or men working in the shadows. It was a world in motion, a complex system where every detail mattered. And for the first time, he understood that he was a part of it. Pedro wasted no time. A few weeks after their first errand, he sent a discreet message to Emilio, requesting to see Joaquín again. This time, it was a riskier mission. The boy was to accompany a convoy traveling the winding roads of Sinaloa to a destination near the coast. Emilio hesitated, but he knew that refusing Pedro's request was akin to burning a bridge he could never rebuild. In the dim light of a moonless morning, Joaquín climbed into a truck, sitting next to a silent driver nervously chewing on a piece of tobacco. Behind them, 2 other vehicles followed closely. Despite his youth, Joaquín sat upright, his hands resting on his knees to hide their trembling. The journey was long, punctuated by the crunch of gravel under the tires and the heavy silence of the men around him. Midway through the journey, an improvised checkpoint blocked the road. 2 men in uniform, rifles slung over their shoulders, signaled for the convoy to stop. Joaquín's heart raced, but he forced himself to keep a composed expression. The driver murmured, barely audible, "Stay calm, boy." act like everything's normal. Pedro has everything planned. One of the armed men approached the truck, his face hardened by years of corruption and mistrust. The driver handed him a thick brown envelope. The man took it, opened it swiftly, and counted the bills with practiced precision. After a moment that felt like an eternity, he nodded and motioned for them to proceed. Joaquín exhaled slowly, only then realizing he had been holding his breath. When they reached their destination, a warehouse similar to the one Joaquín had visited with Pedro, he felt an odd sense of pride. He had passed his first real test. Inside, Pedro was waiting. The cartel leader, simply dressed but commanding in his presence, fixed his gaze on Joaquín for a moment before smiling. "You kept your cool, boy. That's a rare quality. But remember, this was only the beginning. Here, staying calm is the first rule. The second is knowing who trusts you and who you can trust." Joaquín nodded, absorbing every word. He knew Pedro never spoke lightly. Back home, Joaquín found his mother waiting for him on the threshold of their house. Her arms were crossed, and her dark gaze spoke volumes of silent reproach. She said nothing, but Joaquín could feel the weight of her disapproval. He walked inside without a word, knowing any attempt to explain would be futile. That night, lying on his bed, he found himself reflecting on what he truly felt. He was afraid, of course, but there was also an excitement he had never known before. This world, with its risks and rewards, irresistibly drew him in. Months passed, and Joaquín became a familiar face in Pedro's operations. He learned quickly, observing, listening, and, above all, staying inconspicuous. But even in this apparent silence, he was already devising his own strategies. He saw the weaknesses of the men around him, the mistakes they made, and swore he wouldn't fall into the same traps. Pedro, aware of his potential, tested him more and more, assigning him increasingly complex and dangerous tasks. One day, during a meeting in a secluded clearing, Pedro asked Joaquín to speak. Joaquín, taken aback, straightened up, searching for his words. "I think," he began after a moment, "that we could use the tunnels near the border more efficiently. If we connect them to secondary roads, we could reduce the risk of surveillance." Pedro, intrigued, fixed his piercing gaze on him. "And you've thought about how to do that?" Joaquín nodded. "Yes, Don Pedro. I have some ideas." Pedro smiled, a smile filled with both pride and caution. "Then show me what you're worth, boy." This was the start of something new. Joaquín, still young but already remarkably sharp, realized he would never be satisfied with being just a cog in the machine. He wanted to be the one who controlled it. The mountains of Sinaloa seemed smaller and smaller as his ambitions grew. Deep down, he knew it wouldn't be long before he left them behind to conquer a much larger and far more dangerous world. The warm wind swept over the hills of Sinaloa, carrying with it the whispers of secrets that the mountains guarded jealously. Joaquín, now a teenager, had taken on a discreet yet essential role in Pedro Avilés' operations. He was no longer merely the curious observer or the obedient boy following his father. He had become a strategist in the making, a sharp mind that even Pedro himself had begun to consult. One night, at an isolated camp where Pedro's men gathered to prepare for a major shipment, Joaquín stood on the sidelines, listening to the discussions. Pedro, seated near the fire, addressed his lieutenants, outlining the details of a new transportation route. From his corner, Joaquín noticed a flaw in the plan. He hesitated to speak, aware of his young age and the stature of the men around him. But when one of the lieutenants voiced a concern, Joaquín seized the opportunity. "If we take that route, we'll likely run into the Federals. They often patrol near the bridge after midnight. It would be better to use the hill path and skirt the river. It's longer, but it's safer." All eyes turned to him, incredulous. Pedro, surprised by the boy's boldness, fixed his gaze on him for a moment before calmly asking, "And how do you know that, Joaquín?" Joaquín held Pedro's gaze, masking his apprehension as best he could. "I've heard rumors in the village. The soldiers often go there to watch over livestock convoys." Pedro nodded slowly, a faint smile playing at his lips. "A boy who listens is a boy who learns." "Fine. We'll follow your advice." Though minor in the grand machinery of the trafficking operation, this decision marked a turning point for Joaquín. Pedro began to place cautious trust in him, testing his ideas and including him in discussions previously reserved for his lieutenants. Joaquín, in turn, continued to observe and learn. He understood the unspoken rules. In this world, opportunities were rare and invaluable. He couldn't afford a single mistake. Over time, Joaquín began weaving his own web. He cultivated relationships, listened to the complaints of Pedro's men, and identified their weaknesses and hidden ambitions. One evening, while talking to a young halcón, a lookout responsible for monitoring the roads, he heard of a new rival trying to establish themselves in the region. Joaquín reported this information to Pedro, who, impressed by the boy's vigilance, tasked him with keeping a close watch on the situation. It was a delicate assignment, but Joaquín knew it could strengthen his position. Under the guise of delivering supplies or helping with the harvest, Joaquín began traveling to neighboring villages. In truth, he was listening, questioning discreetly, and gathering intelligence on the rival group's movements. When he returned to Pedro with a detailed report highlighting the group's weaknesses, Pedro burst into laughter. "You may not yet have the stature of a man, but you already have the mind of a capo, Joaquín." Pedro's recognition was a victory, but Joaquín knew that every step forward brought him closer to danger. The more influence he gained, the more attention he attracted, and not all of it was welcome. Some of Pedro's lieutenants began watching him with suspicion, no longer seeing him as just a boy, but as a potential threat. Fully aware of this dynamic, Joaquín became even more discreet, focusing on his tasks and biding his time, waiting for the right moment to make his next move. One day, while working on a logistics operation with Pedro, an ambush erupted. Gunfire echoed through the valley, shattering the usual calm of the hills. Caught off guard, Joaquín dove for cover behind a rock. Pedro, with a skill that revealed years of experience, swiftly coordinated a counterattack. The assailants, likely men from a rival cartel, were driven back, but the attack left its mark. 2 of Pedro's men were killed, and the shipment had been damaged. After the attack, Pedro sat near the fire, his face etched with fatigue and anger. Joaquín, still in shock, remained silent. Pedro turned to him and said, "You see, boy, this is the way of the world. You gain a little, and everyone wants to see you fall. If you want to survive, you have to be smarter, faster, and more ruthless than your enemies." Joaquín nodded, absorbing every word. He knew that this attack was only a glimpse of what awaited him if he continued down this path. That night, as the hills were cloaked in darkness, illuminated only by the flickering flames of the campfire, Joaquín made a decision. He wouldn't just be a man in Pedro's shadow. He would build his own empire, no matter the cost. The mountains of Sinaloa, which once felt like a refuge, had now become the stage for a deadly game where only the strongest survived. And Joaquín was determined to be that survivor. The days following the ambush were marked by palpable tension. Pedro Avilés, accustomed to controlling every detail of his operations, became more cautious, even bordering on paranoia. Joaquín observed everything carefully, learning a new lesson. In this world, constant vigilance was the only guarantee of survival. Soon, Pedro entrusted Joaquín with a delicate mission, a test that could determine his future within the organization. He was tasked with escorting a small convoy to a secret safe house near the Pacific coast. This was no ordinary task. The journey was long and dangerous, with federal forces patrolling the roads more frequently. Joaquín accepted without hesitation. He knew this mission wasn't just about loyalty. It was also a chance to prove he was worthy of Pedro's growing trust. The convoy set out at dawn, the sky still painted in hues of orange and pink. Joaquín rode in the front seat of the lead vehicle, an old truck loaded with crates carefully concealed under sacks of corn. The men accompanying him were silent and focused, their faces marked by years of working in the shadows. Despite his youth, Joaquín felt the weight of their trust in him. Every decision he made on this journey could mean the difference between life and death. The trip proceeded smoothly until they reached an improvised checkpoint on a narrow road flanked by steep hills. Joaquín's heart raced as he spotted armed men in federal uniforms. The checkpoint leader motioned for the truck to stop. Joaquín, his palms sweaty but his gaze steady, rolled down the window and greeted the soldier in a voice he hoped sounded calm. The soldier stared at Joaquín for a moment, his piercing gaze attempting to penetrate the young man's mask of composure. "What are you transporting?" he asked in a deep voice. Joaquín responded confidently, "Corn for the market. We're coming from the mountains." The soldier scrutinized the cargo, but before he could inspect further, Joaquín subtly slipped a carefully prepared envelope into his hand. For a coffee, Captain, he added with a controlled smile. The soldier hesitated, then nodded, signaling the convoy to proceed. Once out of sight, Joaquín exhaled deeply, feeling the tension ease slightly. He knew that, while successful, this moment was only a small taste of the dangers that lay ahead. They continued their journey and eventually reached the safe house near the coast. Joaquín oversaw the unloading of the crates, inspecting every detail with a precision that impressed the men around him. When the work was done, he sat for a moment on a rock, gazing out at the vast ocean stretching to the horizon. This world, vast and ruthless, pulled him in more and more. Back in the mountains, Pedro was waiting, sitting in the shade of a tree. Joaquín reported every detail of the mission, omitting nothing. Pedro listened carefully, his gaze betraying a rare satisfaction. "You did well, Joaquín," he finally said. "But remember, this is only the beginning. Every victory makes you more visible, and more visible means more vulnerable." Joaquín nodded, but deep inside, he saw those words as a challenge. He understood that visibility was a risk, but it was also an opportunity. Pedro's men were already murmuring his name with respect and even fear. Joaquín realized that he could no longer remain in his mentor's shadow. To build his own empire, he would one day have to break free from the man who had shaped him. In the days that followed, Joaquín began forging discreet alliances with some of Pedro's lieutenants. He listened to their frustrations, understood their ambitions, and slowly wove his own web. He wasn't ready to challenge Pedro yet, but he knew that day would come. For now, he continued to play the role of loyal protege, learning all he could from the man he viewed as both a mentor and a future rival. One evening, as he sat alone by the fire, Joaquín reflected on everything he had achieved since his first meeting with Pedro. The mountains of Sinaloa, with their imposing silence and hidden secrets, had shaped his determination. But he knew those mountains would only be the beginning. His gaze drifted into the flickering flames, and a thought crossed his mind: this world belonged only to those with the courage to take it. And Joaquín Guzmán Lauro was ready to do whatever it took to conquer it. The months that followed solidified Joaquín's position within Pedro's operations. He no longer merely followed orders, he anticipated needs, finding solutions before problems even arose. Pedro, though commanding and experienced, began to see in this young man a future he hadn't anticipated. But in a world where every rise is marked by betrayal, Pedro knew he had to remain cautious. One evening, in a secluded clearing where Pedro's men had gathered to prepare a major shipment, Joaquín silently listened to the instructions. Pedro outlined a new route to avoid federal patrols, but Joaquín noticed a flaw in the plan. In the past, he might have hesitated to speak up, but not anymore. He stood slowly, feeling the weight of the men's eyes on him. "Don Pedro, if I may, this route is risky. The Federals are increasingly monitoring the main roads. We should consider passing through the northern hills. They're less patrolled and offer fallback points in case of trouble." Pedro narrowed his eyes, staring intently at Joaquín. "Are you sure about this, boy?" Joaquín nodded. "I've studied the patrols. They're concentrated near the border checkpoints. The northern path is longer but safer." Pedro remained silent for a moment, then turned to his lieutenants. "Do as he says." This decision marked a turning point. Pedro's men, who were accustomed to following their leader without question, began to see Joaquín differently. He was no longer just an ambitious young man, he was someone who knew what he was doing. The mission was a success, and Pedro didn't hesitate to acknowledge it. "You did well, Joaquín. But remember, every decision here is a gamble. One day, you might lose big." Joaquín nodded, but deep down, he knew that losing was not an option. Every success strengthened his position, every victory brought him closer to his goal. But success attracts attention, not only from allies. Joaquín began to feel tensions rising within the group. Some of Pedro's lieutenants, uneasy with the growing trust placed in the young man, started to murmur. Jealousies emerged and ambitions clashed. Joaquín, aware of the danger, doubled his caution. He built ties with those he deemed reliable while remaining vigilant against those who saw him as a threat. One day, as he returned from a meeting with Pedro, one of his close allies, Ramon, stopped him discreetly. "Be careful, Joaquín. Some men don't like how quickly you're rising. They're talking behind your back." Joaquín, though already aware of this reality, thanked Ramon. He knew he needed to act before the whispers turned into actions. That night, Joaquín quietly gathered a group of trusted men. Around a fire, in the stillness of the mountain, he spoke openly. "I know some of you question my place here, but what I do for all of us. If we stay united, we'll be stronger. If we divide, we fall." The men listened, some nodding in agreement, others remaining silent. Joaquín knew he couldn't win everyone over, but he had planted a seed. Pedro, while respecting Joaquín, also began to feel the weight of the shifting dynamics. He summoned Joaquín one evening, alone, to an old cabin away from the camp. Sitting face to face, with only a flickering lamp to light their faces, Pedro spoke gravely. "You have talent, Joaquín. I see it. But in this world, that talent can be a blessing or a curse. You must choose carefully how you proceed. If you move too fast, you'll make enemies. If you're too cautious, you'll miss opportunities." Joaquín listened carefully, but he had already made his choice. "I understand, Don Pedro. But sometimes, to survive, you have to take risks." In the weeks that followed, Joaquín focused on strengthening his alliances and expanding his influence. He traveled to neighboring villages, spoke with the farmers, and earned their trust. He understood that power wasn't just about weapons or money, but also about the people who supported his rise. Pedro watched all this, torn between pride and suspicion. He saw in Joaquín a potential heir, but also a growing threat. One evening, as Joaquín gazed at the moonlit hills, he felt the weight of his choices. He was no longer the boy from La Tuna, but a man forging his own path. Each day brought him closer to his goal, but each day also took him further from who he once was. The mountains of Sinaloa, with their wild beauty and constant danger, were both his refuge and his battlefield. Joaquín Guzmán Loren knew the hardest part was yet to come. But he was ready. The silence of the mountains was deceptive. Each night, under the starry Sinaloa sky, Joaquín felt the tension rising around him. The murmurs among Pedro's men became suspicions, lingering glances, and silences heavier than words. He knew that every step he took toward the top pushed him further from safety. But Joaquín was not one to retreat. He had learned that in this world, you either moved forward or disappeared. Pedro seemed conflicted. Joaquín was his most promising student, but he also saw the shadow of ambition in the young man's eyes, a shadow he knew well because he had once seen it in himself. One evening, Pedro summoned Joaquín to his office, a dark and cramped room in an old countryside house. The walls were adorned with maps, plans, and photos of faces hardened by life. "Joaquín, sit down." Pedro gestured to a chair across from his desk. Joaquín obeyed, sitting with his back straight and hands resting on his knees. Pedro studied him for a moment, a faint, almost imperceptible smile on his lips. "You know, boy, you remind me of myself at your age. Ambitious, intelligent, but impatient." Joaquín responded calmly, choosing his words carefully. "With all due respect, Don Pedro, it's not impatience. It's vision. I want to build something that lasts." Pedro chuckled softly, a laugh tinged with cynicism. "Longevity in this world is an illusion, Joaquín. Every empire eventually falls. But I see you're determined. So, I'll give you an opportunity." He leaned forward, fingers interlocked. "A major shipment is scheduled in 2 weeks. It's risky, but the profits are enormous. I want you to lead it." Joaquín felt his heart race. This wasn't just a test, it was a statement. Pedro was placing him front and center with all the responsibilities and dangers that came with it. "Thank you, Don Pedro. I won't let you down." Pedro nodded, his gaze sharp. "I expect nothing less." In the days that followed, Joaquín immersed himself in preparations. He carefully selected the men who would accompany him, inspected every detail of the convoy, and studied the routes like a general planning a battle. Yet, he knew that even the best plan could fail. In this world, luck played as much of a role as intelligence. The day of the transport arrived. The tension was palpable as the convoy set off, 3 trucks moving in a single file along dusty roads. Joaquín rode in the lead vehicle, his eyes fixed on the road while his mind raced. Every turn, every distant silhouette, every unusual sound could signal danger. Halfway through the journey, an incident occurred. a patrol of federals suddenly appeared around a bend in the road. Joaquín quickly signaled his driver to stop calmly. He stepped out of the truck, adopting a relaxed posture, though every muscle in his body was tense. The soldiers approached, weapons ready, their eyes wary. "What are you transporting?" one of them asked, his voice gruff, his rifle pointed to the ground but ready to rise. Joaquín smiled slightly, offering a thick envelope filled with cash. "Just supplies for the market, senor. Nothing worth your attention." The soldier stared at the envelope for a moment, then at Joaquín. The silence that followed felt like an eternity. Finally, the soldier nodded and waved them through. Back in the truck, Joaquín felt the tension ease slightly, but he knew it wasn't over. There would be more obstacles, more decisions to make. Yet, when they finally reached their destination without further incident, Joaquín felt a wave of triumph. He had succeeded. Not only had he completed the mission, but he had also proven he could handle crises. Back at the camp, Pedro was waiting. When Joaquín entered the room, Pedro stood slowly, a rare smile on his face. "Well done, Joaquín. I knew you had it in you." Joaquín thanked Pedro, but deep down, he knew this mission was just a step. He had won a battle, but the war for power continued. In the days that followed, Joaquín noticed the respect for him among Pedro's men growing. But with that respect came increased scrutiny, longer stares, more frequent whispers. Joaquín knew his rise made him vulnerable. And yet, he didn't slow down. Each day, he built his network, consolidated alliances, and planned his next moves. One night, sitting alone under the starry sky, Joaquín gazed at the hills around him. These mountains, which had been his refuge, his school, and his battlefield, now seemed smaller. He knew his destiny lay beyond these borders. Pedro's words echoed in his mind, "Every empire eventually falls." But Joaquín didn't believe that, not yet. He would build something different, something bigger. And this time, he would ensure that nothing could bring it down. The months following the successful transport marked a profound transformation in Joaquín's life. He was no longer a mere pawn in Pedro's organization, he was becoming a central figure. But this rapid ascent came with its own dangers. Each success attracted sharper eyes and fiercer jealousies. Pedro, though admiring, couldn't ignore that Joaquín was becoming more than a protege. He was becoming a potential rival. Joaquín wasn't naive. He sensed that Pedro's trust was laced with caution. In this world, no one gave without ulterior motives. So Joaquín began weaving his own alliances outside Pedro's direct influence. He focused on the smaller factions and the men overlooked by Pedro's strict hierarchy. He spoke to them simply, listened to their grievances, and offered them opportunities. Gradually, he built a loyal, independent base of support. One evening, during a meeting at an isolated hacienda, Joaquín sensed a shift in the air. Pedro, surrounded by his lieutenants, was outlining the details of an important operation requiring cooperation with another cartel. Joaquín observed silently, noting the underlying tensions between Pedro and his allies. The words were polite, but the looks and silences revealed cracks in the alliance. After presenting his plan, Pedro suddenly turned to Joaquín. "And you, boy? What would you do in my place?" Joaquín felt the weight of every gaze on him. It was a test, but it could also be a trap. He replied cautiously, "I think your plan is solid, Don Pedro. But perhaps we could strengthen our position by negotiating for better control of the routes. If we show too many concessions, they might think we're weakening." Pedro stared at him for a moment before nodding slowly. "Interesting. You learn fast." But Joaquín sensed tension in his mentor's voice. Pedro was beginning to understand that Joaquín would not remain a compliant subordinate. He was a rising force, a man who saw beyond merely executing orders. After the meeting, as Joaquín prepared to leave the hacienda, Ramón, one of Pedro's trusted men, discreetly intercepted him. "Be careful, Joaquín. Pedro is testing you, but he's also watching you. Some say he's starting to see you as a threat." Joaquín nodded in acknowledgement, but was already aware of this. He could feel the fragile balance between admiration and suspicion in Pedro's interactions. The time would come when one of them would have to make a definitive move. Back at his camp, Joaquín began formulating his own plans. He knew that to survive and thrive, he would have to break away from Pedro's shadow. But it had to be done carefully. A direct confrontation would be suicidal. Pedro needed to fall, but not by Joaquín's hand. Joaquín had to maneuver the pieces so that Pedro's downfall appeared inevitable, the natural result of the tensions already present. The opportunities came quickly. One day, Joaquín learned that a rival group was attempting to establish itself in a key area controlled by Pedro. Instead of reporting this directly, Joaquín decided to act alone. With a handful of trusted men, he organized a discreet ambush. The rival group was eliminated, and Joaquín ensured that news of this victory reached Pedro before he even returned. Pedro, impressed by Joaquín's initiative, summoned him immediately. "You took risks, Joaquín, but you protected our interests. Well done." Joaquín accepted the praise with humility, but he knew Pedro saw more than a protégé in him now. He saw a man capable of taking his place. The following days were marked by mounting tensions. Joaquín could feel the moment of truth approaching. Pedro, though still dominant, was beginning to lose control over some of his lieutenants. Joaquín, with patience and strategy, consolidated his power. The whispers grew louder and the stares lingered longer. One night, as Joaquín gazed at the moonlit hills, Ramón approached him with a grave expression. "Pedro knows what you're doing. He likes you, but he won't let anyone dethrone him. Be careful, Joaquín. The next time he calls you, be ready." Joaquín nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Thank you, Ramon. I know. But if Pedro wants to play, I'm ready." The next day, Joaquín received the call he had been expecting. Pedro wanted to see him alone at the hacienda. Joaquín prepared himself carefully. He didn't know how the meeting would end, but he knew it would change everything. As he climbed into his truck and headed toward the hacienda, one thought repeated in his mind: power isn't asked for, it's taken. The road to Pedro's hacienda wound through the silent hills of Sinaloa. The clear night sky offered an endless view of stars, but Joaquín paid no attention. His mind was focused, calculating. Every second took him further from the relative safety he had built and closer to a decisive moment. The silence in the truck's cabin was deafening, broken only by the hum of the engine. Beside him, Ramon sat quietly, a weapon resting on his lap. Joaquín knew Ramon's loyalty would be invaluable in the hours to come. When they arrived at the hacienda, 2 armed guards stood by the gate. They quickly inspected the vehicle before waving them through. Joaquín noted their tense postures and furtive glances. Something was different tonight. He stepped out of the truck slowly, casting a final glance at Ramon. "Stay by the vehicle. If things go wrong, you'll know what to do." Ramon nodded, his expression unreadable. The interior of the hacienda was dimly lit, the air heavy with the scent of old wood and cigars. Pedro sat at a large table in the main room, a glass of tequila in hand. 2 of his lieutenants lingered in the background, silent but watchful. Joaquín entered with confidence, masking the tension twisting in his gut. Pedro looked up at him, a near paternal smile on his face. "Joaquín, sit. We need to talk." Joaquín obeyed, taking a seat across from him. Pedro studied him for a moment, the silence broken only by the crackling of the fire in the hearth. "You know, boy, I've watched you grow. I've seen you become what you are today. And I have to say, I'm proud of you. But I'm also worried." Joaquín remained silent, waiting for Pedro to continue. "Some of my men say you're ambitious. Too ambitious. They say you're preparing to take my place. Is that true?" Pedro's gaze was intense, searching for answers in Joaquín's eyes. Joaquín knew that even the slightest misstep could seal his fate. He chose his words carefully. "Don Pedro, everything I've done to protect what you've built. I owe you everything. But if being ambitious means wanting the best for our organization, then yes, I am ambitious." Pedro chuckled softly, but his eyes remained hard. "You're brave, Joaquín. That's why I like you. But you need to understand something. In this world, there's no room for 2 kings." Joaquín felt the tension in the room rise. The 2 lieutenants shifted slightly, their hands hovering near their weapons. Pedro tilted his head as if weighing his protégé's reaction. "So tell me, Joaquín, are you ready to die for what you want?" Joaquín took a deep breath. Don Pedro, I don't want your place. I want our organization to grow bigger, stronger. But if someone has to die tonight, I'd prefer it not to be me. The silence that followed was almost unbearable. Then Pedro erupted into laughter, a deep, resonant laugh that filled the room. You've got guts, boy. But I wonder how long they'll last. Suddenly, a noise outside interrupted the conversation. Shouts, followed by gunfire. Joaquín jumped to his feet, instinctively grabbing his weapon. Ramon rushed into the room, his face grim. Pedro, it's an ambush. There are a lot of them. Pedro cursed under his breath and stood quickly. Who dares attack me on my own territory? Joaquín turned to Ramon. Are the men ready? Ramon nodded. Yes, but we're outnumbered. Pedro, furious, took command of the situation, ordering his lieutenants to defend the hacienda. Joaquín, however, saw an opportunity in the chaos. If he could get Pedro out of this ambush alive, he would earn Pedro's complete trust. But if he failed, it would all be over. The battle was brutal. Gunfire echoed through the night, flashes of light briefly illuminating the tense faces of the fighters. Joaquín fought alongside Ramon, coordinating defenses with remarkable precision. Pedro, despite his age, displayed impressive strength and determination, personally taking down several attackers. After an hour of intense combat, silence fell over the hacienda. The attackers had been repelled, but at great cost. Pedro, drenched in sweat and blood, approached Joaquín. You fought well, boy. Maybe even better than me. Joaquín, out of breath, replied with a faint smile. I was just following your example, Don Pedro. Pedro placed a heavy hand on Joaquín's shoulder. Tonight, you proved your worth. But remember this, Joaquín, in this world, enemies come from outside and sometimes from within. Joaquín nodded, but deep down, he knew this was more than a warning, it was a threat. That night marked a turning point. Joaquín had earned Pedro's trust, but he knew it was fragile. He had to tread even more carefully now, as his next move could decide everything, his downfall or his ascension. The days following the ambush were marked by an uneasy calm. The hacienda had survived, as had Pedro and his men, but Pedro's grip on power seemed to waver. Joaquín, now seen as a cornerstone of the operations, felt the delicate balance shifting. Pedro continued to watch him closely, teetering between admiration and suspicion. Joaquín wasted no time. He used the chaos of the attack to strengthen his own alliances. The men who had fought alongside him that night spoke of him with respect. They saw him not just as a strategist, but as a leader capable of protecting his own. Joaquín knew this support had to be solidified. Every conversation, every promise, every glance became a move on the complex chessboard he was constructing. One morning, as the sun rose over the mountains of Sinaloa, Joaquín traveled to a neighboring village to meet an old contact. The man, an elderly farmer who had once worked as a smuggler for Pedro, held valuable information about rival factions. Joaquín listened carefully, noting every detail: internal rivalries, new alliances, weaknesses along the routes. Every word was a potential weapon. Back at the hacienda, Joaquín discreetly gathered Ramon and a few trusted men. Around a roughly carved table, he laid out his plan. Pedro is losing his grip. He knows it, and he knows I'm gaining ground. But we can't act too soon. We need to weaken his remaining support. If they lose faith in him, they'll turn to us. Ramon, loyal but cautious, nodded. And if Pedro figures out what we're doing? Joaquín smirked slightly, his gaze cold and determined. Then we'll have already won. The following weeks were marked by a series of subtle yet decisive maneuvers. Joaquín used the information he had gathered to discreetly sabotage some of Pedro's operations. Shipments disappeared, key contacts were arrested or turned. At first, Pedro blamed external rivals, but Joaquín ensured suspicion slowly turned inward toward Pedro's own lieutenants. Doubt was creeping in, and Joaquín stayed in the shadows, observing and waiting. Pedro, however, was not a man easily deceived. One evening, he summoned Joaquín for a private conversation. Seated in the dimly lit room of his office, Pedro fixed the young man with an intense gaze. "Joaquín, things are going wrong. I don't know who, but someone is trying to destabilize me." Joaquín, perfectly controlling his emotions, replied with faint calm, "Don Pedro, I'm with you. Tell me what I can do to help." Pedro remained silent for a moment before sighing. "You might be the only one I can still trust." Joaquín nodded, but he knew this trust was laced with suspicion. Pedro was searching for answers, and Joaquín had to ensure he didn't find the right ones. The tension reached its peak during a meeting between Pedro and his lieutenants. Joaquín sat at the table, silently listening as Pedro outlined a desperate plan to reclaim lost territory. But the men present were hesitant, some murmuring doubts under their breath. Joaquín waited for the right moment before speaking. "Don Pedro, with all due respect, this plan is risky. If we fail, we lose everything. Perhaps we should consider a different approach." Pedro stared at him for a long moment, his eyes shining with an unreadable intensity. "And what's your idea, Joaquín?" Joaquín knew this was a turning point. "We need to consolidate our forces before striking. Rally our allies, cut off the roots of our enemies. If we attack now, we'll be vulnerable." Some of the men nodded, murmuring their agreement. Pedro, however, looked frustrated. "Perhaps you're right, Joaquín, but I'm beginning to wonder where your loyalty truly lies." Silence fell over the room. Joaquín felt the weight of every gaze on him. He responded calmly, "To you, Don Pedro. Always." but he knew that words alone would no longer be enough to quell Pedro's doubts. The following night, Joaquín received a cryptic message from Ramon. Pedro has ordered a secret meeting tomorrow. Be careful. Joaquín understood immediately that the moment had come. If Pedro saw him as a threat, he would act. But Joaquín had already made his preparations. Entendu. Voici la traduction strict et fidèle au texte original. When the meeting took place in an isolated clearing, Joaquín arrived surrounded by his men. Pedro, seated on an old wooden chair, waited with a handful of his lieutenants. The air was thick with tension. Joaquín greeted Pedro respectfully, but he could sense the atmosphere was different. Pedro spoke in a grave tone. Joaquín, you're like a son to me. But in this world, even a son can betray. So tell me, what do you have to say for yourself? Joaquín, his hands clasped in front of him, replied calmly. Don Pedro, I have only ever wanted the success of our organization. But if you doubt me, then perhaps you should doubt everyone. Pedro appeared to ponder this for a moment, then slowly stood. But before he could speak or act, Ramon and Joaquín's men moved into position, their weapons at the ready. The silence was broken by murmurs among Pedro's lieutenants, who hesitated, unsure of where their loyalties lay. Joaquín stepped forward. Don Pedro, this isn't what I wanted. But it's time for a change. You built this empire, and I'm grateful. But for it to survive, it needs new leadership. Pedro, despite the situation, gave a bitter smile. You're smarter than I thought, Joaquín. But remember this power will consume you one day, just as it consumed me. Joaquín nodded respectfully. Perhaps. But today, it's mine. That night, Joaquín Guzmán Loera became the undisputed leader. But he knew that this power, seized through cunning and force, came at a price. And he was prepared to pay it. The silence of the clearing after Pedro's departure echoed like the closing of a chapter. Joaquín stood in the center of his men, his gaze fixed, his jaw clenched. He had won, but he knew this was only a battle in an endless war. Pedro had left without physical resistance, but his final words lingered in Joaquín's mind. This power will consume you. Back at the hacienda, now under his control, Joaquín felt the weight of leadership. The lieutenants who had watched him with suspicion days earlier now came to pledge their allegiance. But Joaquín, ever cautious, knew their loyalty was conditional, as was everything in this world. He addressed them with a calm but firm voice, laying out his vision. What we have today is just the beginning. If we want to survive, we must think bigger, aim farther. More territories, more roots. But we won't achieve that through unnecessary wars. We need to be smarter. The men nodded, some genuinely convinced, others out of necessity. Joaquín knew he had to act quickly to solidify his power. He began restructuring the operations. The internal factions that had clashed under Pedro were unified under a single command. He replaced unstable lieutenants with men he trusted implicitly, such as Ramon, who became his right-hand man. Joaquín also focused on expansion. He sought to establish alliances with other cartels using diplomacy where Pedro had often relied on brute force. During a meeting with a rival leader at a luxurious villa near the coast, Joaquín revealed a side of himself few had seen. "We can keep fighting over scraps," he said calmly, "or we can work together to control the true market." His words, though risky, resonated. The agreement that followed allowed Joaquín to secure several strategic routes without shedding a drop of blood. However, not everything was simple. Pedro, though deposed, hadn't disappeared. His remaining supporters, though few, posed a constant threat. Joaquín sent men to monitor Pedro's movements, anticipating a possible counterattack. But Pedro seemed to have withdrawn, content to live in an isolated hacienda, far from the conflicts. Joaquín, however, knew better than to underestimate him. Months passed, and Joaquín became a respected and feared name throughout Sinaloa. But with power came increased pressure. The Federals intensified their operations, driven by information from anonymous sources. Joaquín suspected Pedro was behind the leaks. Yet every attempt to ensnare him failed, thanks to Joaquín's carefully woven network of informants and allies. One evening, as Joaquín sat in his office, he received an unexpected visit. A young man entered, nervous but determined, carrying a sealed letter from Pedro. Joaquín opened the envelope and read it slowly. The message was brief. "Enemies always come from within. Remember this, Joaquín. The power you've taken makes you more vulnerable than you realize." These simple words resonated deeply. Joaquín stood, gazing out the window at the dark hills. He knew Pedro was right. The danger didn't only come from authorities or external rivals, it came from those around him every day. In the days that followed, Joaquín tightened his security even further. He organized surprise meetings, testing the loyalty of his men. Those who showed signs of weakness or betrayal were removed without mercy. Yet, despite his precautions, he felt a growing threat lurking in the shadows, intangible but ever-present. One night, as Joaquín returned from a successful operation, his convoy was ambushed. Gunfire erupted from all sides, lighting up the night with blinding flashes. Joaquín, inside his armored vehicle, coordinated the counterattack with cold efficiency. His well-trained men fought back fiercely, quickly repelling the attackers. But this incident marked a turning point. Joaquín knew his reign would never be peaceful. Back at the hacienda, he summoned Ramon. "We need to find out who's behind this attack. This wasn't random. Someone wants me dead, and I want to know who." Ramon nodded and immediately launched an investigation. But deep down, Joaquín knew this silent war would never end. Every victory, every territory gained, every enemy eliminated only raised the stakes. Sitting alone in his office that night, Joaquín thought back to Pedro's words, "This power will consume you." He could already feel it. But for Joaquín Guzmán Laura, there was no turning back. The only path he saw was one that led ever higher, ever further, no matter the cost. The days following the ambush were filled with a mix of heightened vigilance and simmering anger. Joaquín knew the attack wasn't the work of an external rival, it bore the mark of internal betrayal. In this world, invisible enemies were the most dangerous. Yet he remained calm, ordering his men to strengthen defenses while discreetly investigating. Ramon returned with information a few days later. It was one of our men, a trusted lieutenant, who sold the information. He was working for the Federals in secret. Joaquín was silent for a moment before asking coldly, "Where is he now?" Ramon lowered his eyes. "Dead. Our men took care of him before he could say more." Joaquín nodded, but he knew this didn't solve everything. If one man had betrayed him, others might follow. He convened a meeting of his lieutenants at an isolated hacienda. Around a large wooden table, every face reflected tension. Joaquín, seated at the head of the table, studied each of them before speaking. The ambush wasn't just an incident. It was a warning. "We have traitors among us, and they think I don't see them. But I promise you this, anyone who opposes me or endangers our organization will not live to tell the tale." His tone was icy, and the men nodded silently. Joaquín knew he was sowing fear, but it was necessary. Loyalty could not be bought or asked for, it had to be imposed. Meanwhile, Joaquín continued to expand his influence. He was no longer content with the mountains of Sinaloa. He set his sights on international routes. Through strategic alliances with Colombian cartels, he secured a steady flow of cocaine, transported via ingenious tunnels and clandestine maritime routes. Every successful transaction bolstered his reputation, but also drew increased attention from authorities and rivals. One day, Joaquín received troubling information. Pedro, his former mentor, seemed to have resurfaced, quietly regrouping his forces. Rumors spoke of secret meetings and new allies. Joaquín didn't take this lightly. Though he had supplanted Pedro, he knew the man's experience and network still made him a formidable threat. He decided to strike first. With Ramon, he planned an operation to infiltrate Pedro's circle and gather intelligence. One of his trusted men, embedded among Pedro's remaining supporters, soon sent news. Pedro was trying to form a coalition with a rival cartel, hoping to reclaim control of Sinaloa. Joaquín couldn't allow this. One night, as Pedro and his allies gathered in an isolated villa, Joaquín launched a swift attack. His heavily armed men surrounded the property, neutralizing the guards before they could raise the alarm. Joaquín, accompanied by Ramon, entered the villa, weapon in hand. Pedro, seated at a table with his allies, slowly rose as he saw his former protege. "So, boy, you've come to finish what you started?" Joaquín remained calm, his gaze steady. You taught me many things, Pedro. But you also taught me that there can only be one leader. Tonight, I closed this chapter. Pedro smiled, a sad yet defiant smile. You think this power is a victory, Joaquín. But it's only a burden. One day, it will crush you. Pedro's allies were executed by Joaquín's men, but Joaquín himself did not fire a shot. He stared at his former mentor for a moment before saying, I'm letting you live, Pedro, not out of mercy, but because you're already finished. Live with your failure. He turned and left, leaving Pedro alone in the empty villa, surrounded by the echoes of his past. As Joaquín departed, he felt a strange sensation. He had won, but at what cost? Each victory made him more powerful, but also more isolated. Every enemy eliminated created a void that others sought to fill. Back at the hacienda, Joaquín stood on his balcony, gazing at the mountains. The hills that had once seemed so vast now felt small. He controlled more territory than he had ever imagined, yet he felt like a king trapped in a gilded cage. Pedro's words still echoed within him, this power will consume you. But Joaquín knew there was no turning back. There was no room for doubt or regret. Everything he had built had to be protected at all costs. In this world, only the strongest survived, and Joaquín Guzmán Lower was ready to fight to the very end. The weeks following his confrontation with Pedro were marked by an eerie calm. Now in total control of Sinaloa, Joaquín consolidated his empire with ruthless efficiency. The roots were secure, profits were soaring, and his network of alliances extended far beyond Mexico's borders. Yet Joaquín knew this peace was an illusion. Every day, he woke with the certainty that enemies would come. Be they rivals, traitors, or the authorities, danger was ever present. One morning, as he reviewed reports from his lieutenants in his office, Ramon entered with a grave expression. Joaquín, we have a problem. The Federals are ramping up operations near the tunnels. They arrested 2 of our men last night. Joaquín looked up, his face impassive. Have they talked? Ramon shook his head. Not yet, but they're in bad hands. Joaquín nodded. Find a way to get them out. And if that's not possible, make sure they never talk. The following days were tense. Joaquín personally oversaw security measures, ordering the temporary closure of some tunnels and rerouting shipments via maritime routes. He knew every move was being watched. But deep down, he felt something else, a growing weight, a fatigue that wasn't of the body, but of the mind. One night, under the faint light of the moon, Joaquín found himself alone on the balcony of his hacienda. The view he had once admired now felt suffocating. Everything he had built, everything he had gained, now held him prisoner. His thoughts were interrupted by Ramon, who entered quietly. Joaquín, we have information. One of the lieutenants you recently promoted seems to be playing both sides. He was seen talking to American agents. Joaquín turned to him slowly, his gaze icy. "Are you certain?" Ramon nodded. "Absolutely. What do you want us to do?" Joaquín remained silent for a moment, then replied in a calm but cutting tone, "Bring him to me tomorrow. I want to talk to him." The next day, Joaquín sat in his dark office, a room adorned with mementos of his rise to power. The lieutenant in question entered, nervous but trying to mask his fear. Joaquín studied him for a moment before speaking in an almost friendly tone. "You know, I've always believed loyalty is the foundation of everything. Without it, nothing holds together. So tell me, why did you decide to betray me?" The lieutenant, caught off guard, stammered an incoherent response. Joaquín rose slowly and approached him. "You know, I could kill you right here and now. But I want to understand. What did they promise you? Money? Immunity?" The cornered lieutenant finally cracked. "They threatened my family, Joaquín. I had no choice." Joaquín stared at him for a moment, his face unreadable. Then he turned to Ramon. "Make sure his family is protected. As for him, you know what to do." The lieutenant tried to plead, but Joaquín raised a hand to silence him. "It's not personal. It's the price of betrayal." Ramon nodded, and two men escorted the lieutenant out. Joaquín remained alone in his office, staring at the table before him. Every decision he made seemed to pull him deeper into an abyss. But there was no room for hesitation. The power he had built had to be defended, no matter the cost. Months passed, and Joaquín focused on international expansion. With the help of contacts in Colombia and Europe, he established new routes, employing advanced technologies to evade surveillance. But the higher he rose, the greater the pressure became. The Federals intensified their operations, rivals probed for weaknesses, and rumors of internal betrayal multiplied. One evening, Joaquín received an anonymous phone call. A calm but menacing voice said, "You're too visible, Joaquín. Too powerful. And when someone shines this brightly, everyone wants to see them fall." Joaquín hung up without responding, but the words stayed with him. He knew they were true. Every victory made him more vulnerable. Standing once more on the balcony of his hacienda, gazing at the lights of the villages below, Joaquín recalled Pedro's words, "This power will consume you." He already felt their truth, but there was no going back. Every day was a battle, every decision a double-edged sword. He turned and returned to his office, pouring himself a glass of tequila as his gaze drifted into the void. He knew the end would come, sooner or later. But until that day, Joaquín Guzmán Lora was determined to hold on, to rule over the empire he had built with his own hands, no matter the price. The nights of Joaquín Guzmán Lora grew longer. The empire he had built continued to expand, but he paid the price in both body and soul. Threats were everywhere. Every move by the authorities or his rivals seemed designed to destabilize him. Yet he held firm, clinging to his power like a captain to his ship in the midst of a storm. A new crisis arose when one of his convoys was intercepted by the Federals. The cargo, worth millions, was destined for a key market in the United States. Joaquín knew this loss wasn't accidental. Someone, somewhere, had betrayed him. Ramon, ever loyal, arrived with news. Joaquín, we've found the source. It's one of our U.S. network leaders. He's cooperating with DEA agents. Joaquín listened calmly, but anger simmered beneath the surface. Bring him here immediately, he ordered. Ramon left without question. A few hours later, the man in question, an American named Carl, was brought to the hacienda, bound and visibly terrified. Joaquín sat across from him in a dimly lit room, the flicker of a single lamp and the glow of cigars casting shadows across their faces. Carl, Joaquín began, his tone almost friendly, do you know why you're here? The man nodded nervously. Joaquín continued, I gave you a position of trust, resources, a life most would dream of. And you betrayed me. Why? Carl stammered, trying to come up with an excuse. They found my family. They forced me. Joaquín silenced him with a gesture. It's always the same story. But you knew what you were getting into. And in this world, Carl, there's no room for the weak. A heavy silence followed. Joaquín stood, adjusted his jacket, and nodded to Ramon. Do what you have to do. As he left the room, the sound of a gunshot echoed behind him. Joaquín didn't flinch. He knew that every decision he made, no matter how brutal, was necessary to keep his empire intact. Despite these challenges, Joaquín didn't slow down. He invested in more sophisticated technologies to secure his operations. He had more complex tunnels constructed, complete with rail systems to speed up deliveries. He recruited cryptography experts to ensure secure communications. Every setback became an opportunity to learn and strengthen his position. But the more he innovated, the more his enemies adapted. DEA agents intensified their pursuit. Temporary alliances among rival cartels formed in the shadows, all aiming to overthrow Joaquín. Rumors spread of conspiracies among his own lieutenants, but Joaquín had no time to be distracted by suspicion. He had to stay one step ahead. One day, while inspecting a new tunnel near the border, Joaquín received a message from his informants. The Federals are planning a major operation against you. They've located several of your warehouses. Joaquín remained outwardly calm, but his mind raced. Prepare the warehouses for immediate evacuation, he ordered. Make them think they've caught us. The trap worked. When federal forces raided the warehouses, they found only empty facilities. Joaquín had already moved the goods to even more secure locations. But he knew this victory was only temporary. Every day, his enemies were getting closer. Back at the hacienda, Joaquín took a moment to reflect. He looked out at the mountains, the hills that had witnessed his rise to power. He remembered Pedro's warnings, the sacrifices he had made to get where he was. Power was a flame, bright but dangerously destructive. Joaquín could already feel its heat, but he had no intention of letting go. As he sipped a glass of tequila, Ramon entered, looking troubled. "Joaquín, we have a problem. One of the rival cartels is working with a paramilitary group. They're advancing on our territory." Joaquín calmly set down his glass and stood with icy determination. "Then we'll remind them who controls these mountains." The war that followed was brutal. Joaquín used every resource and strategy at his disposal to repel the attacks. His men, galvanized by his leadership, fought with fierce loyalty. But the war came at a cost. Lives were lost, resources were depleted, and the authorities' attention intensified. One evening, as Joaquín gazed at the stars from his balcony, Ramon approached him. "Joaquín, we've won this battle. But how much longer can we keep this up?" Joaquín remained silent for a moment before replying, "As long as it takes. In this world, Ramon, there's no rest for those who rule. But we'll keep going because it's the only thing we know how to do." And so Joaquín Guzmán Laura, the undisputed leader of Sinaloa, continued his fight. Each day brought more isolation, but he remained standing. In the darkness of this world, the only thing that mattered was staying at the top, no matter the cost. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. Joaquín Guzmán Laura, despite mounting tensions, continued to rule his empire with cold determination. But each day seemed to draw him closer to the inevitable. The Federals tightened their net, alliances grew more fragile, and even his most trusted lieutenants occasionally hesitated under the weight of critical decisions. One night, as Joaquín worked in his office, Ramon entered hurriedly. "Joaquín, there's a meeting of rival cartels in the eastern mountains. They're planning something against us." Joaquín looked up, his face as impassive as ever. "Who's behind it?" Ramon quickly replied, "A man from the Jalisco cartel. They're trying to take control of our main routes." Joaquín stood slowly, adjusting his jacket. "Then we need to act before they do. Gather the men. Let's show them what it means to defy Sinaloa." At dawn the next day, Joaquín led a swift attack on the cartel meeting. With surgical precision, his men surrounded the area, cutting off all exits. Joaquín, dressed in black, stepped calmly out of his vehicle, weapon in hand. "Gentlemen," he said in a chilling voice, "you should have known better than to conspire against me." The battle was quick and brutal. Joaquín's men, well-trained and better equipped, overwhelmed their enemies. Joaquín himself didn't hesitate to take up arms, coldly gunning down those who tried to flee. When the dust finally settled, he stood amidst the bodies, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "No one takes these mountains," he murmured. But this victory, as resounding as it was marked a turning point for Joaquín. The Federals, tipped off by anonymous witnesses, intensified their pursuit. The routes he had controlled for years were now under surveillance, his hideouts raided, and several of his lieutenants arrested. Joaquín knew the net was tightening, but he refused to falter. One night, as he once again looked out at the hills from his balcony, Ramon entered with a grim expression. "Joaquín, there's been a betrayal. We lost an entire convoy, and the Federals couldn't have known without inside help." Joaquín, tired but ever calculating, nodded. "Find out who it was. And when you do, make an example of them." The days that followed were marked by a relentless hunt. Joaquín personally interrogated his men, listening to every word, every hesitation. Eventually, a name surfaced, a trusted lieutenant, one of the few who had worked with him since the beginning. Joaquín felt a heavy weight settle over him. Betrayal was always bitter, but even more so when it came from those he thought loyal. The lieutenant was brought before Joaquín, bound and terrified. "Why?" Joaquín asked, his voice calm but icy. "Why did you betray me after everything I've done for you?" The man stammered, searching for an excuse. "They threatened my family. I had no choice." Joaquín closed his eyes for a moment, then reopened them with cold resolve. "In this world, there's always a choice. And you made the wrong one." He gestured to Ramon, who carried out the order without hesitation. Joaquín stared at the lifeless body, feeling a mix of anger and weariness. Every betrayal cost him more than just a man. It eroded his trust in everything and everyone. As tensions rose, Joaquín felt the grip of the authorities tightening faster than he could anticipate. One evening, as he pondered his next steps, crucial information reached him. The Federals had located his main hideout in the mountains. Joaquín immediately ordered an evacuation, but he knew it wouldn't be enough. He had to disappear, to go into hiding until the heat subsided. In a carefully orchestrated operation, Joaquín left his hacienda under the cover of night. With a small group of loyalists, he retreated into a network of tunnels he had constructed years before. Surrounded by earth and darkness, he reflected on his future. For the first time in a long while, he questioned whether it was all still worth it. Months passed in hiding. Ever cunning, Joaquín continued to coordinate his operations from the shadows, using intermediaries to keep his empire afloat. But he knew his time was running out. The Federals, aided by informants and advanced technology, grew closer by the day. One morning, after a restless night, Ramon entered the hideout, his face grave. "Joaquín, they're closing in. We need to leave immediately." Joaquín rose, his gaze steady as he looked at his old friend. "I knew this day would come. Let's go." But this time, the luck that had saved Joaquín so many times before abandoned him. As they passed through a remote village en route to another safe house, Federal Special Forces launched a lightning operation. Joaquín was captured after a brief confrontation, surrounded by dozens of armed soldiers. His final words to Ramon before being taken were simple. Continue. Never let what we've built fall. As the helicopter cut through the air, Joaquín Guzmán Lara remained impassive, his gaze fixed on the fading mountains of Sinaloa. Those hills had witnessed his birth, his rise, and now his capture. But Joaquín was not a man who gave up easily. Behind his silence, his mind was already at work. Every weakness in the system, every potential opportunity was forming into a plan. To him, even a gilded cage was only a temporary obstacle. Upon his arrival in Mexico City, the reception was harsh. Handcuffed, surrounded by special forces, and under the relentless flash of the media's cameras, Joaquín showed no sign of weakness. Journalists shouted questions, cameras strained to capture every flicker of emotion on his face. But he gave them nothing. To them, he was El Chapo, a legendary criminal. To himself, he was still Joaquín, the boy from La Tuna who had learned to survive no matter the circumstances. The trial that followed was a grand spectacle. The authorities, eager to display their triumph, laid out mountains of evidence, recordings, testimonies, financial records. Former allies, pressed into deals for reduced sentences, took the stand to detail his operations. Joaquín listened impassively, analyzing every detail. On several occasions, he smirked when obvious lies were presented as truth. But he knew the verdict had been decided long before. When the sentence came, life imprisonment in a U.S. supermax prison, Joaquín didn't flinch. His enemies thought they had won, but he saw beyond it. A prison was just another barrier, and he had overcome far worse. Transferred to ADX Florence, the Alcatraz of the Rockies, Joaquín found himself in a tiny cell, isolated from the outside world. Artificial lights turned on and off at fixed hours, and the guards only spoke to give orders. It was an attempt to break his spirit, but Joaquín was used to solitude. In this environment, he even found a strange sense of order, a reprieve from the chaos of his past life. But Joaquín Guzmán Lara was not made for captivity. Each day, he observed, listened, and searched for weaknesses. He noted the guards' rotations, inspection routines, and internal communication systems. He knew escaping such a place was nearly impossible. But nearly was not a certainty. And Joaquín had built his life on exploiting the improbable. Outside, his empire wavered but didn't collapse. Ramon, true to his promise, had taken the reins, working to maintain alliances and fend off rivals. The lieutenants who had sworn loyalty to Joaquín continued to operate in the shadows, ensuring that his name remained a legend even behind bars. One day, Joaquín received an unexpected visit. Emma Coronel, his wife, entered the small visitation room, dressed simply but elegantly. Her eyes betrayed a pain she tried to hide. Joaquín smiled softly at her. "Emma, I'm glad to see you." She took his hands through the thick glass, tears brimming in her eyes. "Joaquín, They want to break you. But I know you'll find a way." That meeting reignited a fire within him. Joaquín knew his family, his name, and his legacy were still at stake. No matter the difficulty, he would find a way out. Over the following months, he crafted a plan using the limited resources at his disposal. A corrupt guard here, stolen information there, every small detail became part of a complex puzzle. The opportunity came during an unexpected security system failure. With calculated precision, Joaquín sent a cryptic message to his men outside. The plan was set in motion, a series of coordinated actions to distract the authorities and create a breach in the supposedly impenetrable ADX Florence system. This time, it wasn't a tunnel beneath the earth that freed him, but a network of human and technological interventions. When Joaquín finally escaped the prison, it was an achievement that made global headlines. But this time, he didn't hide in the mountains. He had learned from his past. He knew that the shadows were safer, that power could be wielded from afar without direct exposure. Joaquín disappeared, his face never again appearing in public. Yet in the streets, the ports, and the markets, his name still circulated. Joaquín Guzmán Laura was more than a man. He had become an idea, a symbol of defiance and ambition in a world where rules only applied to the weak. And in the hills of Sinaloa, the stars still shone over the territory he once called his kingdom.